Hello and welcome back, and thank you for joining me again. So we're continuing the theme with how we approach the Bible and interpreting it. But first I want to start off with a couple of questions that arose from the last conversation. One question arose, and it concerned my comment that interpretation is best done in a community. And the question was, can that approach not lead to democratization of scripture? In other words, it becomes sterile because its function is to just bring a sort of a sterile unity. And yes, that is a risk, but that is not the sort of interpretation I mean. I'm talking about interpretation that it focuses on listening rather than speaking, where there is a sense of trying to identify new points of revelation, to take you down passages you've not been down before, and to think of perspectives and concepts that you've not yet considered. I think it's a little bit like the early creeds were written through community. Yes, a certain group got together, but that group represented the unity and diversity of many young, developing Christian communities. And they brought together the harmony of that collective wisdom. So yes, there is a risk, but I think it is how you want to approach scripture. Are you looking for revelation, or are you looking for something that doesn't not cause any contention and is sort of closed? And that is the risk of the written form. The second question arose was, I said that from my perspective, interpretation should always be done through the lens of Christ. The Christ revealed to us, particularly in the Gospels, should be the lens that we look forward and back through Scripture. And the comment was, well, how can what we know of Christ in the New Testament, how can we know that is trustworthy? Because he wasn't there. And in one way, it links to an earlier conversation where I spoke of Jesus as the reconciling Logos, who was reconciling things to himself right from the start. So his sort of presence is there, is to be seen, and he's pulling people towards himself as an overarching concept. But that's not what I want to talk to you about today. That particular question leads me on to the oral tradition of the New Testament. Now, we should not be concerned when we talk about oral tradition. And what I mean by that is a community telling stories to retain its memory and to build its knowledge. Because cultural anthropologists and human sciences from a wide range of disciplines have studied this in great detail, and overwhelmingly the robustness of a storytelling community to retain and develop its wisdom and retain its central truths is overwhelmingly trustworthy. So when I talk about oral tradition, please do not think it is not robust as writing something down. For most of us, we have been brought up to trust things in writing. We read it and we reflect. But that wasn't the case in Jesus' day. Overwhelmingly, people shared stories. They performed the narratives of their community, and that's how they retained their distinctiveness. So, for example, Jesus spoke in parables. But he wasn't the only one. Many religious leaders, rabbis, used parables as a way of illustrating foundational truths. So when I talk about storytelling, when I talk about performance, do not be concerned when I talk about that in respect to the New Testament. However, truth in oral communities are not so much interested in chronology. It is not like a history book. What they are interested in is retaining meaning and a way of developing the social memory of a community, which can then help it withstand problems in the future from learning from the past. So this is critical. The people that told these stories were trusted in their communities. These were the bards, the actors, the rabbis, the elders. And they were all told in community. So if any distortion came in, it would be spotted and it would be corrected. That is the nature of the community. And it's not only in terms of Christ, but in everything that they did, they communicated to the community in this way. And without such a robust mechanism for communication, societies were vulnerable to outside influences. So we have to accept that there is no original version of the gospel. Bear with me. Because we have to contend that the earliest gospel, Mark, was probably written late 60s, AD 69, 70, somewhere around there. So what happened in the years 33 till then? Well, people were not waiting around for somebody to write something down. They were telling the Jesus story. And this robustness that I'm talking about, you see in the Gospels. The Gospels are a result of this developing oral tradition. That's why if you look at Matthew and the Sermons of the Mount, you get all these incredible sayings of Jesus in one teaching episode, because it is meant he is using it as a teaching device. Whereas in Luke, those same sayings can be found, but they're scattered throughout his gospel. Again, it is not the chronology that's important, but the substance, and that's what we have in the four gospels. Unity, but diversity. So my contention is that the written gospels started as oral gospels. But what is interesting to me is that once they had been written down, the oral tradition did not stop, and there's very practical reasons for this. Roughly 10% of the Judean populations were illiterate, and estimates are about 10% of Jesus' earlier followers were either illiterate or semi-illiterate. And there was no newspapers, no internet, no social media. Therefore, at the end of the day, there was nothing to do but discuss the important matters of the day. And there was no more important matter than this incredible ministry of this incredible Nazarene and what that meant for the community. And it meant so much for the community that they changed their story. They developed this counter narrative as they discussed Jesus and what he said and what he did and how he fulfilled so many promises and gave them hope, that they aligned their story with his story. This is the robustness we have in the gospel, a complete change from one type of community to a Jesus serving community. It is quite incredible. So where does the idea of the original gospels being narratives lead us to as we consider how we approach the Bible? Well, I have said, and I think it's worth reiterating, that the structures of these communities are so robust that we can trust in the written Gospels that we have, because distortion was not allowed to creep in. Because if distortion was allowed to creep into a community social memory, it left them very vulnerable to all events outside of their control and within the community itself. Secondly, the impact of this oral tradition meant that communities were actually changing their worldview because they were so captivated about the stories of Jesus and the things that he did and the hope that he gave. A community does not change its allegiance if they're not captivated, if the subject that they are telling stories about does not become their ultimate object. Also, in the gospel accounts that we have, we see a reflection of the unity and diversity that you get in oral storytelling communities. So we can have trust that these have developed probably with 30, 40 years of people reflecting on the nature of Christ. And lastly, this is always a litmus test for me. If you hear a story and then you change your life accordingly, and then you find that story to be untrue or unreliable, or it doesn't fulfill the promises that you thought it answered, then that story dies because you turn away from it. But the story hasn't died. We who are followers of Christ are still telling the story. And what's really interesting for me, in terms of my interest in oral tradition, is that we are still telling it anew and fresh while keeping hold of their central truths. And in this, hopefully you can be comforted in the understanding that we too understand how oral tradition works. Because a good preacher can bring the truths of Scripture, but bring a new flavour, a new emphasis to something, and sometimes even fresh bread. Likewise, so can the poet, the dancer, the musician bring the Gospels to light in new and creative way. But the central truths do not change. And if you change them, that new gospel soon fades away. Anyway, that's the end of this quick talk on the oral tradition. There is much more to be said on it. I'm very interested in this because it was a subject that I studied for my doctoral dissertation. So I have some first-hand knowledge of how robust this way of storytelling is. But next time I'm very excited because I am going to be interviewing a Cypriot friend I'm going to interview, and I'm going to draw out from him how he approaches the Bible and how he understands it from within his Orthodox tradition. So I'm very excited about that, and I hope you can join me. So thanks again. See you next time, and every blessing to you and yours. Goodbye.